Good afternoon, everybody. It's Vaughan Granier here from HR Assured. I'm just waiting for the last few participants to join us. We'll start in a matter of seconds. Thanks so much for your patience. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. What I'll be doing with you is taking you through a webinar on preparing for the arrival of fair pay agreements, as you can see in front of you. Please feel free to ask questions or to raise your hand at any point, and I'll try and answer your questions. There will be time at the end if you want to write everything down, and we can work through the questions together at the end. So my name is Vaughan Granier. I'm the National Workplace Relations Manager for HR Assured. I have worked internationally in human resources for upwards of 25 years now, and I've worked across Australia, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and South Africa, and of course New Zealand, where I've been for the past 13 years. And I work to provide consulting services and information and employment law advice to our clients across HR Assured in New Zealand. I'd like to introduce our family to you. So we have a family of companies that are primarily based in Australia, but we have three businesses who operate in New Zealand. Those are HR Assured, Enable HR, which is the software platform of HR Assured, and QMS Certification Services, which provides assistance with ISO accreditation and various matters like that. What we do is we provide a number of benefits to if you partner with us. You have access to the HR and WHS services, including our 24/7 telephone advice service, our comprehensive HR and WHS audit, which will enable you to benchmark your systems against what is required by law. And then we can also work with you to support you and overcome any gaps in your audit process and make sure that you're fully compliant. We have HR software, which provides a strong foundation for all of that. We provide a workplace law insurance and representation, workplace health and safety software, and a full library of legal resources that are maintained current in New Zealand law by a firm of solicitors. Throughout our webinar today, you'll hear us refer to these resources that our clients all have access to. And after the webinar, we would like to follow up with each of you to see if we might be able to help you as well. Today, what we're going to cover is an introduction to the fair pay agreements, what they're all about and where they come from. We're going to look at the proposal that the government put forward, the potential impact that proposal has, what the parameters are around bargaining, so we have a full understanding of what it's likely to require from us as employers. And then because we have a sister company in Australia, which has 122 modern awards already, we'll be able to draw on the Australian experience that our sister company has and that various employers in Australia has to give you a lot of information about how the fair pay agreements or the Australian counterpart, the modern awards, have worked out for the Australian business environment. And then obviously questions as much as possible in whatever time remains. All right, so let's begin. So the fair pay agreements have been regarded as the biggest change to employment law in recent history. That is the general comment that seems to be echoing most across these proposals. And I think it's fair to say that it does present something as massive as that to the employment law landscape in New Zealand. And yes, it does affect employers far more than it affects employees. And obviously that's why we're here. And that's the basis of today's presentation. To give you an idea of where we are at the moment, so the bill was introduced in March and the first reading happened on the 5th of April, a week later, and it is now before the Select Committee. And what the Select Committee has done is it has requested representations from throughout New Zealand. So there are various representations that have been made. I can assure you that many have been made. by numerous employer organizations and individual employers. They've also sought advice of barristers and solicitors, and obviously trade unions have also participated. So those submissions are all currently before the Select Committee, who is working through them and will present a report to us on the 5th of October as to what they believe is the appropriate way forward. At that point, the proposal will probably be redrafted in some form or another to accommodate the representations that have been made. And we'll then go for a second reading, then to the Committee of the Whole House, a third reading and royal assent, which is when the Fair Pay Agreements bill, whatever it's called at that stage, will become law and will be binding in New Zealand. So we're still fairly on in the process, but what I can tell you is that submissions have closed. Everyone who was able to make a submission has made a submission, and effectively the process is now on autopilot. And from here, the representations of business will no longer be considered except for what has already been entered into the Select Committee records. I will take you through a few of those submissions a bit later on, just to show you the level of input that is being had and give you some confidence that there's a lot being submitted to the government around this. But we'll get to that in due course. Let's go on to now what is a fair pay agreement. Okay, so the government basically has created these agreements that are intended to set minimum terms and conditions for all employees within an industry or occupation. Now, we need to go over that in some detail because it is a fairly new concept for New Zealand. It's basically enforced collective bargaining. It's a scheme for the collective bargaining of minimum terms and conditions for an entire industry or an entire occupation category. So what we're talking about here is effectively that, for example, in Australia, the Clerks Award is an award that covers every person who operates as a clerk in any business anywhere in New Zealand, in Australia. So what we're looking at is an award that would take a business or a employment category like clerk and create a agreement or some minimum wages and terms and conditions that cover every clerk in every business in New Zealand. That would be an occupation category award. The other kind is an industry award, where you might say, as my example here is, in the construction sector, this would be the award that covers the entire construction sector, and every business that is classified as a construction business would require to be compliant with the construction sector award. Okay, so using the example here, a fair pay agreement covering the construction sector would set and standardize key elements such as wages, hours of work, overtime, penal rates for working outside of normal hours, leave entitlements, and redundancy if that became a law, amongst other things, for all workers in the entire construction sector. This would mean that a small business employing a small number of construction workers would also be required to comply with the construction fair pay agreements in respect to those workers, whether or not those workers are union members. This would also mean that big players like Fletcher and various large organizations who are in the construction industry would be setting standards by their power and involvement in the sector that might impact on smaller employers who don't have the ability to comply with those sectors. So it becomes a very, very large club-like thing that is going to affect an entire industry, whether or not certain people want it to or not. So that's the opinion of PwC thought leaders on what a fair pay agreement is. Now, what the government says it is, and they obviously have the agenda of appealing to their voter base and making sure that employees are protected. It is a Labour government, of course, so that is going to be one of their primary concerns. The Fair Pay Agreement is designed to provide a framework to enable all workers across a particular industry or occupation to collectively negotiate for fair pay instead of negotiations between unions and particular employers. So what you can see here is the anticipation and the understanding that union representation is going to increase, and unions are going to increase in power in terms of their ability to negotiate with particular employers. And I'll talk through the statistics of unions in New Zealand in a short while so you can understand how that change is going to happen. All right. So the original purpose as described is to increase bargaining power, ensure minimum pay and employment terms are reflective of the needs of sectors covered by a fair pay agreement. And this is a very contentious statement here: to create an environment where businesses compete based on better products and services rather than some trying to compete by driving down wages and conditions. Now, in reality, this particular statement has become one of the fundamental criticisms of the Fair Pay Agreement, because it has been observed, and not without justification, that the primary organization driving down wages and conditions is the government itself, in the sense that the government budgets and sets budgets for various businesses and industries that rely on it for income. And if they don't provide enough funds, then those industries are the ones that suffer the most. For example, the bus drivers associations. So it's possible to argue that this criticism of employers driving down wages and conditions may well include the government as a particular employer doing exactly that as well. It's not an unfair criticism, but it does not take away the fact that there are some businesses that do that. Okay, and obviously they want to incentivize training and motivation. The idea behind the long term of the government's fair pay agreements is obviously boost standards of living, improve economic productivity, and that is another area where a lot of businesses have complained and said there is no guarantee, and in fact there's no track record anywhere in the world where fair pay agreements increase productivity itself. It's not a system designed to increase productivity. So that is an intense criticism being made of the fair pay agreements. And they want to establish better dialogue between employers and workers. This is another area where significant criticism has come, because the allegation by a business is that there's already good communication between workers and employers. There's already cultures within businesses about how people talk to each other. And what this agreement will do, or what fair pay agreements will do, is reduce that and formalize it in a forum that is not designed for constructive communication, but rather for conflict-based communication. So that presents a challenge as well. All right, so looking at the numbers overview that I promised you. So we have 97% of the New Zealand economy is small businesses. And what that means is that there are a large number of employers who are not going to be in a position to drive their wishes in a fair pay agreement. They'll be relying on much bigger employers to drive the business viewpoint in a fair pay agreement. And that means that they could feel slightly disenfranchised or majorly disenfranchised by the fact that other people are speaking on their behalf. We have a 17% unionization rate in the New Zealand workforce. This is a decline from 2010, which is why the Labour government is really concerned about it, but it is up from 2017. There are currently only 137 registered unions with 374,000 union members, okay? And there has been a 3% growth in union membership from 2017. But what this basically means is that there are very few worker representatives, unions and worker representatives themselves, who have collective bargaining experience. It's not a very common thing in New Zealand to have collective bargaining. There are very few unions and very few people who have the capacity to operate in a collective bargaining environment. It's not a skill that is common to the New Zealand environment. Even fewer employer representatives have collective bargaining experience. There are very few industry associations who can actually manage this. Most of those have made submissions in respect of the fair pay agreements, and they're not positive about it. But there is fundamentally a lack of skill from both sides, employer and employee, within New Zealand to handle collective bargaining at this kind of level. So that will create probably, because we are guessing here, it will create a level of inefficiency and possibly poor outcomes as opposed to what was intended at the outset until people acquire the skills they need. The one challenge that's important to remember is that once the fair pay agreement starts in its process, employers cannot opt out of a request to negotiate a fair pay agreement. So whether or not you've got the skill to do it, you will be drawn into it. And there will be a very rapid learning curve at the early stages for everybody to achieve the skills they need at obtaining the right outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the process of the bargaining, which is I'm sure what all of you are interested in, and we'll go through that in some detail right now. If you have an existing HR issue, please feel free to scan this QR code. It will appear later in the webinar as well, and this will give you the opportunity to call the HR Assure team in New Zealand for a free trial advice session. All right, so please feel free to do that. So moving on right now to the process. I'm going to set out for you the process of how the government intends for fair pay agreements to be negotiated. Pardon me if I go silent every now and then, I do have a frog in my throat. So this is the basic layout of the fair pay agreement process, all right? So what is basically said is that a party collects evidence to demonstrate it meets the representation or public interest test and applies to begin bargaining. Now, this is not an employer. This is the union or a workforce body that wishes to initiate collective bargaining. Okay, so there are two basics. There's either the representation test or the public interest test. Now, you might say, for example, that the public interest test would be that nurses are all paid the correct amount and that that we need to address those issues, or teachers or police force or whatever. So those may be very, very significant and obvious public interest tests that those sectors need this kind of thing. Otherwise, you'd have a representation test where the threshold is 10%. Or 1,000 workers within an area of the economy, 10% of a workforce. And that would be the basis on which a union could then say, well, we have representation and we want to bargain for a fair pay agreement. Now, 10% in an employee, in a company of 20 employees is 2 employees. In an industry with maybe 10,000 employees or 100,000 employees in it, like the construction industry, the representation threshold is only 1,000 workers. So there's a significantly small threshold which has currently been set forward for the beginning of fair pay agreement bargaining. Okay, so those are the three situations: either public interest, 10% of a workplace, or 1,000 workers within an employee sector. So this initiates the bargaining process, and this is how it would begin. The union would demonstrate that they had the required level, and a bargaining process would then begin. If the parties reached an agreement on what the bargaining process should be and what the actual fair pay agreement should reflect and say, they would then submit that fair pay agreement that they had agreed on to a vote. And if it was passed, it would then go to the ERA to set up the or to confirm the conditions. If it failed that first vote, it would go back to the bargaining process for a second attempt to reach the bargaining agreement, and then a second vote. And if it passed that vote, it would become law through the Employee Relations Authority. But if it failed, it would then go to the Employment Relations anyway for the Employment Relations Authority to decide what the fair pay agreement would be. So the process is designed to always create the Employment Relations Authority as a gatekeeper of what gets agreed. And once the Employment Relations Authority either agrees with what the parties have negotiated, or has made a determination for itself as to what should be the fair pay agreements, a fair pay agreement is then in place. Okay, so basically there is no backstop here where an employer can opt out. There's no way for an employer to start the negotiation process. It's done by the union. And once it's done, the employer has to enter the process and stay in the process as much as possible so that they can influence the outcome on their side. But they cannot withdraw from the process and refuse to have a fair pay agreement in place. All right. So now the bargaining process, this is basically setting out what I've really spoken about. But it's important to note is that bargainers must endeavor to represent the maximum number of those under coverage, including non-members. So unions are not going to be negotiating just for unions. They'll be negotiating for everybody in that sector and industry. Okay, and it's really important that Maori interests and views must be represented throughout this process. The other thing as well is that companies will not be able to say that unions are not allowed to enter their premises for fair pay agreement consultations. That is an automatic right that is given to unions to enter the workplace for fair pay agreement consultations. This does not get in the way of health and safety requirements that people must be properly inducted and have the legitimate right or permission to access, but there's no way that an employer could reasonably refuse access because it's a really important process. It is possible, as I say here, for companies to work with Business New Zealand or an employer body to assist in having representation and some skill to do this if they need to. But currently, employers do not really have a lot of cooperative models in place, and it might be something that employers want to do is begin to talk to colleagues in the industry, other employers in the same sector, so they can become ready for what's going to happen when fair pay agreements do come into place. There are exemptions that will be provided for in certain circumstances. So when an employer would experience significant financial hardship by participating in a fair pay agreement, they would be able to apply to be excluded from it. There would be significant proof required of that. It wouldn't just be an opinion of the owner, for example. There could also be regional differences. So, for example, construction industry in Auckland may pay differently to the construction industry in Invercargill, and that would become something that was clarified, and a different rate would apply in different areas based on that. Okay. Now, support for the bargaining process. This is financial support. The government has allocated $50,000 per side as a financial contribution, and this is based on the idea of 4 fair pay agreements being noted per year. So the government has essentially set aside $200,000 a year, or $400,000 a year, basically, for fair pay agreement negotiations, with each side in each negotiation getting $50,000. This would enable them to get legal advice, get some support, pay for consultants, and make sure that they were doing the best job they could for their representatives. And then obviously the trade union and Business NZ as the main nominated support organizations would each receive $250,000 a year, because they would be the primary drivers of achieving fair pay agreements on behalf of various representatives. The fair pay agreement itself, once it's finalized, it would have to go to the Employment Relations Authority, and then there would be secondary legislation which would enforce the agreement. So effectively, fair pay agreements would become law, and this is very much like they are in Australia, where they can be regarded as law in terms of non-compliance. There can be penalties, there can be labour inspectorate interventions, and it would engage the standard dispute resolution process of the Employment Relations Act for a fair pay agreement disputes. So we would have mediations, we would have arbitrations, and we'd have employee relation authority over disputes around the fair pay agreements. Now, what are the likely consequences for all of this? It is that there would be definitely an increase in business costs that business may feel unable to control or be disenfranchised from. These would be direct employee costs. We don't know how minimum rates might be changed by this, leave entitlements, overtime pay entitlements. I can tell you that in the modern award system in Australia, there are significant changes to all of these fundamentals that occur as a result of fair pay agreements. And obviously compliance costs as well. These would be either the increased cost of payroll, the increased cost of human resources services, such as ourselves, or internal HR managers who might be called on to give advice, and also court costs and various issues relating to making sure that you've achieved the outcomes. It is a reality that we are going to have unions with a legislatively embedded authority and power, and this would probably be far outsized compared to what they actually represent in the workforce. That's a deliberate design of this bill as it currently stands, because the government has made a clear commitment to increasing the power of the unions within the workplace. Okay, and they want to stimulate union growth. Okay, and then obviously smaller employers will be bound by negotiated outcomes. One of the significant factors, I think, is that this is a legislation, or sorry, election strategy. So I think it's fairly safe to say that this act is going to be really important to Labour in terms of gaining popularity with their electorate, and it could tip the scales in the next election. Now, what we don't know is in which direction it will tip the scales. Obviously, if there is a significant representation for fair pay agreements, and this bill enables the unions to gain power, that would affect the election outcome in the direction of Labour. But if it works the other way, it may not. So we don't know what effect it's going to have, but it certainly will have an effect on the election next year. Okay, so there are a number of possible challenges, and I'm now going to take you through some of the representations that have been made by various parties, just to show you that there are significant brains and significant resources going into a critique of this bill to make sure that it is as well drafted as possible within the power of business to actually make representations against the government. Okay, so one of the submissions was in terms of a report written by Andrew Butler, a barrister, and he basically says that there are therefore several features of the Fair Pay Agreements Bill which, in my opinion, are not consistent with or are unlikely to be consistent with Section 17 of the Bill of Rights Act. Chief among these, and these are very significant objections, which if the government ignores them, it's possible to say the government has departed from its own values. But they do want to implement the fair pay agreements, so we'll see what happens here. So the first one, chief among these, is universal coverage. That is where the Fair Pay Agreements Bill covers the whole of New Zealand and every single person within New Zealand, whether or not they want to be covered, which follows on to the departure from the principle of voluntariness. It interferes in multiple ways with party autonomy, and it completely prohibits employers from initiating bargaining for a fair pay agreement. Okay. So what he says at the bottom there is, if the Fair Pay Agreements Bill had confined itself to workers in those sorts of jobs alone, which means low paid, insecure, or unsafe jobs, the limits of the Fair Pay Agreements Bill imposed on freedom of association would be more likely to be reasonable and justified in a free and democratic society. What he's basically saying is that there are a number of jobs, because it covers universally throughout New Zealand, lawyers, doctors, actuaries could also have fair pay agreements that cover them. But it would be very hard to argue that they were in low paid, insecure, or unsafe jobs. So the Fair Pay Agreements Bill, as it currently stands, is probably overreaching itself in terms of its desired goal. In the words of the Employers and Manufacturers Association, they regard the government as using a sledgehammer to crack a very small nut. Okay, the EMA believes fair pay agreements are a rear vision mirror policy to address an issue that, if it exists at all, exists on a minor scale that does not require one-size-fits-all sledgehammer taken to a current industrial relations framework. Now, they have a very lengthy submission, and at the end of it, they summarize by saying the EMA believes that fair pay agreements are not the future for New Zealand workforce or our economy, as they impose an outdated, archaic view of working life on employers and employees. They will not achieve the goals the government believes are the outcomes, and they will impose more costs and red tape on employers. Now, I'm giving you a very brief summary of a very long report. And the Restaurant Association, which has a number of workers who will be most affected by this, and there's something called job hopping or job hurdling, where people do a number of different jobs within a workplace, and the Restaurant Association has a significant number of those. And the fair pay agreements will actually prevent job hurdling and job hopping, which will increase the costs of service workers, and in fact even prevent people from doing that kind of thing, which means that it would affect the Restaurant Association and its members significantly. And they have made these 5 recommendations, which is a really positive angle on it rather than a criticism. But they've made these 5 recommendations to try and create an environment where, if a fair pay agreement is implemented, it will do so in a positive way that adds real value to the Restaurant Association. So what is positive for employers? There will definitely be an increase in sophistication and bargaining skills that will result in interest-based bargaining and not horse trading. That is a very, very significant benefit. And if employers can partner with the unions to become more interest-based bargaining, there will be definitely a value add because you can achieve value add through negotiating far better on an interest-based bargaining perspective than on a horse trading perspective. So basically, interest-based says, what do you need and how can we give it to you? Whereas transactional horse trading is, what do I want and how can I get it from you? And that different viewpoint could make quite a difference. The Fair Pay Agreement will minimize industrial action. The danger, however, is though that for both sides, it prevents strikes and it prevents lockouts. And those are two things which are key weapons in the hands of each party for actually moving their interests forward. And a complete ban on industrial action is not actually what is envisaged in employment law and in labor law worldwide. So this move in New Zealand is quite unique within the world labor context. And then obviously upskilling frameworks which will improve local skills availability. That will be fantastic, but it's a hope, not a guarantee. So looking now at lessons from Australia, we've had modern agreements or modern awards in Australia for the last 12, 13 years. So it's really good to see what Australians think about the modern award system because that'll give us an idea of what it's likely to mean for us. Unfortunately, it's not entirely positive. So 12 years on from the introduction of awards, that means the Australian economy has had 12 years to work with these awards. This is what Key Point Law says. The role of modern awards and how they apply are one of the most misunderstood aspects of the Australian industrial landscape. Many employers do not properly understand their obligations and the requirements imposed on them by their operation of modern awards that cover their employees. Now, the bottom line is that they've had these awards for 12 years. Employers have been working with these awards for 12 years, and they still don't properly understand them. And you have to read a modern award to understand how that can be the case, but I can assure you it is the case. So in Australia, there were 1,500 awards that were reduced down to 122 in 2010. They are supposed to have 4 yearly reviews. They have not had 4 yearly reviews because they are simply too complicated to review. Descriptive words used in respect of these modern awards are confusing, complex, frustrating for business, and challenging. Centralized changes that are made by the negotiating teams at a centralized level require significant local interpretation and implementation, which means people are often waiting for wage decisions to be handed down. So they can read the award, they can do their best to understand it, but they will still need a court decision when there's a dispute to help them understand what is actually going on with the wage decisions. Okay, and you have rapid implementation timeframes, last minute decisions, and there's rushed calculations creating errors and back pay. Now, just to tell you that my sister company in Australia, HR Assured Australia, handles a lot of the employer advice around these things, and there are spreadsheets that you cannot believe trying to work out the impact of the changes. There are telephone calls day in and day out. What do we do here? Does this work? Does this award apply to us? And these are people who have their own HR managers and are trying to understand these awards. So it's not necessarily going to simplify matters. I think that's really important to understand. If you go through and read any of the modern awards in Australia, you will see that they do not necessarily simplify matters. Even though they're intended to do so, it's not an outcome that can be guaranteed. So, what you have in terms of why these awards are complicated is largely the overlapping coverage. So, what you would have then is you would have, for example, in a single industry, you might have 2 or 3 awards that apply to one workplace. So, I remember working in Australia in a business that manufactured something and then stored it in a warehouse and then distributed it. So you had the manufacturer's award that covered the manufacturing employees. Once the goods were moved into the warehouse, you had the warehouse award and the storage award covering the employees who worked in the warehouse. But you also had employees who worked in both. They did some manufacturing and they did some warehouse work. Which award covered them? And then it came down to a percentage calculation of how much time did they spend in which area of the business. And you might have had two employees, and one spent more time in manufacturing and one spent more time in warehousing. And they had the same job title, but because of the percentage calculations, different awards applied to them. You then had the distribution award and the logistics award, which applied to those people. Then, when you go back into the factory or into the business, you had the clerks award applying to all of the administrative people who were doing administrative work in the offices. So you had a significant number of awards in one workplace, and that's how you can have overlapping awards. Each of them have their own overtime rates. Each of them have their own overtime thresholds, and so on and so on and so on. So unfortunately, it's not a significantly encouraging view forward on what's going to happen with the awards. But if the Australian system is copied in New Zealand, it's almost certain that this will increase complexity around payroll, around understanding the awards, and of tracking what each award means for your workplace. All right, so overlapping coverage is a very significant issue. There's amazingly complex calculations that have so far defeated almost every automated payroll in Australia. You may have seen headlines around the awards that have been granted against places like Woolworths in Australia, where it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and admittedly they're a very massive employer, but they had payroll systems, and those payroll systems were previously fine and were working out payroll for their workforces, but they could not match the complexity of the award system. So we need to make sure in preparation for fair pay agreements that our payroll systems in New Zealand are very, very capable of handling the complexity of calculations and thresholds and rules that might get established around payroll. There are indications that small to medium employers bear the brunt of increased costs. What you find there is that senior employers, the larger companies, generate solutions that work for them, that don't necessarily work for smaller employees, and smaller employees bear a higher proportion of cost to make sure they comply with the awards in New Zealand, in Australia, than the large employers do. So it becomes an increasingly burden on these small to medium employers. Again, market flexibility and adaptation is reduced. This is, again, something that the fair pay agreements are intended not to do, but it has happened in Australia that the award system has reduced market flexibility and reduced adaptability because it's required so much administration that businesses are spending money literally on the wrong thing. And there are significant legal, advisory, and compliance costs. Okay, so a trusted expert advisor is absolutely key to partnering employers with the fair pay agreements. If we learn anything from Australia, it's that our sister company fields huge numbers of award calls on a daily basis, calls about coverage, calls about interpretation, calls about calculations, and getting advice early is key. Those clients that call our helplines early in an issue before it becomes big have smaller issues and solve their problems quicker and retain credibility with their employees. Clients who do not call until the very last minute generally find themselves sorting out far more complicated a mess, and they suffer credibility issues both with the union and with their own employees. So the only advice I can give you here is never assume that what you know is everything that you need to know. Ask, ask, and ask. Especially payroll errors, especially those, multiply exponentially by time and by employee numbers. So the more we can do to catch them early and check often on whether we're still compliant, the better we'll do. To give you an example, a 50-cent per hour error in a business that has 20 employees is $20,800 per year of an error. Even if it's just an error in leave pay calculation, it's $1,600 a year. 50 cents an hour makes a massive difference. And often it's more than that. Sometimes it's less than that. But it's really important to do these checks as early and as often as possible. So what we're facing right now is there's a couple of months to go. We are in August. In October, the Select Committee will present its report. And after that, there'll be a redraft of the bill, and then it will go through to Parliament for various readings until it becomes law. It's going to happen. Business has done its best to represent as much as possible the interests of business and employers in New Zealand. I've read all the submissions that have been made. They are significant, they are persuasive, and the only question is, will the government listen? And we can only hope that they will. Where we stand is we are able to support you in the build up to this phase and into everything that happens going forward. There are many companies like us, but we are especially skilled at having the advice on hand to provide you the support that you need for your payroll queries, for your HR queries, and everything else you might need. This is the QR code where if you want to arrange a free consultation call to test out our advice line, you can please just click on this QR code or go to hrassured.co.nz and you will be able to register for a complimentary call. To remind you again, these are the different services we provide, and I would love to answer your questions now to make sure that you felt like you had got as much information as you could out of the experience. So I see some questions in the chat here, and I'll go through and I'll read those to you and answer what I can. All right, so has there been an indication at all of what could be involved, e.g. overtime rates differing based on when time is worked? The Australian Fair Work Agreements are so complicated. I dread the thought of them being launched in New Zealand. So this is very true. This is exactly the issue. If you go to the Fair Pay Agreements website, you will see just how complicated it is. But to give you an example, some of the agreements in Australia will say that overtime pay is 1.5 for the first 2 hours, and then it's twice the normal rate for any time after 2 hours. Other ones will say it's 1.5 for the first 3 hours, and it's double time after the first 3 hours, and so on and so on. Some of them will have overtime ceilings on a daily basis. Some will have overtime ceilings on a weekly basis. So there is a lot of complexity around this, and we don't know how it's going to work out. This is the problem with leaving individual sectors and individual unions and employers to negotiate based on their own interests. If there's a sector that works a lot of overtime, they would like to, the unions in that sector would probably like to reduce the amount of overtime and would want to punish employers by increasing the cost of overtime so that it's not worked. So that's where you get the different motivations to create a different agreement around overtime. So in terms of the another question, is there any agreement that this will be thrown out and not go any further, or is it definitely going to happen in some shape or form? If it were not an election strategy, I would say there's a fair chance that really strong opposition from the business sector would change it fundamentally. But, and I'm not a political pundit, so I don't accept my thoughts as being gospel on this. I think the Labour government is staking a lot of credibility on this particular piece of legislation. So I think it's going to happen. I don't think it will be thrown out. And if it does get thrown out, I think we'll have dodged a bullet. But I think it will happen in some shape or form. And I can only hope that the representations made by business are going to reduce its negative impact on the economy and on employers. The third question here is that Australian awards cover pay frequency as well. Do we know if the New Zealand ones will do that? Pay frequency being whether it's weekly, fortnightly, or monthly pay. I think it's one of the natural consequences of negotiating pay and negotiating all the regimes around that, how it would work. Because obviously pay frequency can affect a lot of things, like how long it takes to get paid overtime. It affects things like timekeeping. It affects the costs of payroll, because if it's paid weekly, you've got 52 pay cycles a year, fortnightly 26 pay cycles a year, monthly 12. So you'd find that employers would love to pay less, and because of the saving in payroll costs, but that requires stronger cash flow management to make sure you've got enough money for a much bigger payroll once a month or once a fortnight. So it becomes a give and take around that one, and I'm pretty sure the unions and the employers will argue around that one substantially. And the last question here is only a half question. I'm sorry. How broadly specific will the industries be? I think if I can guess at the specificity here, I think the unions would like it to be as wide as possible in terms of the entire construction industry. So if you think about that, in the construction industry, you could have internal fit out, you could have scaffolding, you could have equipment hire, you could have actual construction workers themselves, the chippies, the blockies, all of these different people, quantity surveying, you could have engineering. They would like this to cover as much as possible, but I think the industries themselves will fight very hard to be as focused as possible so that whatever is agreed applies as well as it can to them and does not include people that it does not necessarily apply to in whatever they agree. So you might find that quantity surveyors, for example, would insist on negotiating their own if they could, but it'll come down to what unions ask for as to whether that's even possible. Coverage is something that will be negotiated. So I can imagine that the businesses would push very hard for coverage to be very localized and very specific. And that balances against how many eventual awards you're going to end up with. Because if you do that too much and you've got 1,000 awards as opposed to a manageable amount. So that's where we stand on that one. Are there any other questions people might like to ask? I've only had those 4, so I can't comment more on those questions, but hopefully that was significant benefit to you. Once again, we'd love to hear from you for a trial call, and hopefully this has proved valuable to you. I understand at this stage of the Fair Pay Agreements Bill, it's not the most positive news that this is possibly going to be quite an influential bill that will change the employment landscape substantially. It will do that. The best thing we can do is get as ready for it as possible. And hopefully in future, we'll have a bit more clarity and have another webinar where we could actually tell you some details as to what's going to happen. Please look out for that. We will always be here. We'll be providing this advice to you. Okay, so thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everything. And I certainly hope this has been beneficial to you.